Oh. We are live! Hello! Welcome to the first book club discussion of 2022.
Yeah.
Very exciting. We're not going to talk about how it's later than we wanted.
Yeah.
We're very excited and also a bit scared because this book is like a behemoth. So in case, you're just popping in and you've not read the book, we're going to be discussing Angela
Carter's Nights at the Circus, not to be confused with the Night Circus.
Oh my god, it was terrible, like googling stuff online for this discussion, and it's just all the Night Circus. But this is Angela Carter's. Hello! I lost my train of thought. I got so excited. Oh yeah, this is the first novel of hers that I've read. So The Bloody Chamber, that she wrote in 1979, 5 years previously to this, is one of my favorite books of all time, and I have pored over that book. So it's really like incredulous that I haven't read anything else by her by now. It's a little bit insane. So I was very excited to get to this. But you've read one of her other books,
right? I've read The Magic Toy Shop, which I really love, but had similar things with this in that I loved the beginning, and then I thought the middle was really good, but like not as good as the beginning, and then the ending.
Yeah, we will get to that. Oh, Kieran, hello. Welcome. Did you read the book? I bet not. Kieran does not read. Sorry. Right, I mean, part of me is like, should we just wait for people to show up? But then also we have so much to get through that we could just go and then people can catch up on their own time. So a bit savage.
Oh, look, first off, like, who's read along with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 people here, so I'm guessing Rowan and not Kieran, sorry. Exactly, that's what I thought. I know that Rowan was trying to finish it in time, so she's definitely started it, but anyway, should we just get going?
I've mostly finished.
That is such a mood. Yeah. I mean, we have finished, but also
it was
you
a
don't
struggle.
Feel like it is a struggle to like at the end of it. But yeah, let's get our slides up. Eee! Oh my god, me, I'm like falling out of the frame.
You just pushed me further away.
Freudian slip. Right, so welcome. I'm going back to our slides, so apologies if we are not active with the chat for about 5 minutes while we just look at our slides. So yeah, welcome. This is Nights at the Circus. Obviously, from the title, we can glean that it's set at a circus for the most part. And also, you wanted to say something about the time period that it's set in.
Oh yeah, it's at turn of the century. So the kind of fin de siècle, moving into 1900. And it's quite an interesting time because the book talks a lot about kind of the experience of being a woman and kind of like how much power women have within the patriarchal society. And that was a kind of big question at the time with the kind of rise of the new woman, with things like there was this kind of conservative journalist writer which she was like the first woman to make a proper like full-time living through writing, but she wrote this essay in 1868 called The Girl of the Period, which is kind of the new woman, and she's kind of talking about how women have gone downhill because they're not specifically talking about English women, they've gone downhill because English women used to be like pure and like innocent, and
by now, conservative do you mean Tory?
Yeah, okay. yeah. It's so yeah, and it's interesting that it's set in that kind of time period where there was a lot of change, a lot of build up towards obviously like suffragette movement, but and people kind of were kind of both looking forward but kind of afraid how that would impact their kind of social position.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that is definitely, especially with the focus of it being Fevvers, who is not just a woman at this time, but like a very controversial woman, which we'll get on to. So I guess that brings us on to our first sort of question, which is mainly, I guess, it is the crux of the novel, essentially. Or, I mean, you start the novel thinking it will be the crux of it, and then we get off into some other things. But the beginning of the book, the first part, which is set in London, so the book split into 3 parts. We have London, Petersburg, and Siberia. And so the London part is firmly about Fevvers and whether or not she is fact or fiction, beauty or beast. And we join her in her dressing room where she's being interviewed by an American journalist, Jack Walzer, and he's very skeptical so far of who she claims to be. And also in this dressing room, as she is recounting her story, is Lizzie, who is, we believe, to have found Fevvers at birth, but we don't quite know their entire backstory. But Lizzie has taken on a sort of maternal caregiver role with Fevvers, and is quite a bit older than her, I think. So I mean, I didn't even say that she had wings. So the whole point of the thing is she fact or fiction, is because Fevvers is the talk of the town, the Cockney Venus. She is this circus sort of performer, actress, who can perform on the high wire, on the trapeze, but she has these huge wings that come out of her shoulders. So obviously the talk of the town is whether or not she is real, is she is some mythic beast, or is she just a con woman pretending to be something more than she is, really. And that is sort of what Jack Walzer...
don't let people kind of come up close to her. And also there's a lot about when Walzer first sees her perform, he's talks about how they don't take it too far, so that there's still that question of whether she is real or not real, and how that kind of both kind of brings in more sales, because it's like a point of
like
conversation.
Come see for yourself,
but it's also kind of keeps her safe, because if she is this does really have wings, it's like something that a lot of people might want to take advantage of.
It is exactly like what you say, and we do see that happen later on in the novel. So the first opening paragraph that we have of the book is Fevvers herself talking to Jack in her dressing room, and she says, well, I should read the whole. I'm not going to do the accent. I did it for you, but like maybe not on the internet. Speaking of accents, though, if you haven't yet read the book and want to engage with it, I would really recommend the audiobook read by I forgot her name. Is it and it's like Andoa something, Anjo, and she's in Sherlock. She's an actress, and she's really not Sherlock, Doctor Who, and she's really really good. And she does really all of the accents. She does Fevvers' Cockney accent. She does the American for Jack, and like the Kentucky for like the Colonel later on, and Russian as well. Like just such a colourful performance, and it really brings to life that sort of like gritty like atmosphere. Anyway, that was sidetracked, but also her name is Fevvers. I don't know, it's not clear, but when you say the word feathers in a Cockney accent, it's Fevvers, like. Yeah, so that's where I didn't get that until I listened to the audiobook, when she explains like where her name came from, because she gets found on the street, and then one of the Cockney girls who picks her up was like, it looks like she's got feathers, and then that's why she's called that. Anyway, oh my god, Anna. Right. So she says, Lord love you, sir, Feathers sang out in a voice that clanged like dustbin lids. As to my place of birth, why, I first saw a light of day right here in smoky old London, didn't I? Not build the Cockney Venus for nothing, sir, though they could just as well have called me Helen of the High Wire, due to the unusual circumstances in which I come ashore, for I never docked via what you might call the normal channel, sir, or dear me, no, but just like Helen of Troy was hatched out of a bloody grey egg while the bow bells rang, as ever is. And immediately, just because, Greek myth mind, picked up on this immediate linkage of Helen and Fevvers. Fevvers is this sort of mythic being, beautiful, and, Helen is like the face of all 1,000 ships. People went mad over her beauty and her, all the misconceptions around her, which we all went into in great detail when we talked about Pandora's Jar. So that's a really interesting link at first with Fevvers, of this sort of beautiful mythic thing that a lot of people want to possess and feel like they know her story already before actually meeting her. Oh my god, Leanne's here. Hello, Leanne. Very exciting. I can't keep interrupting your train of thought. I'm sorry. So yeah, what was the next point? Oh yeah, Walzer's backstory. So he's in this dressing room listening to Fevvers tell her story to tell, and then we obviously get a little bit of background about
He's doing
him.
it for an article that he wants to write.
So this is the sort of knowledge that we get of Jack. In the course of his adventuring, he discovered himself a talent with words, and an even greater aptitude for finding himself in the right place at the right time. So he stumbled upon his profession, and at this time in his life, he filed copy to a New York newspaper for a living, so he could travel wherever he pleased, whilst retaining the privileged irresponsibility of the journalist, the professional necessity to see all and believe nothing, which cheerfully combined in Walter's personality with a characteristically American generosity towards the brazen lie. His avocation suited him right down to the ground, on which he took good care to keep his feet. Call him Ishmael, but Ishmael with an expense account. And besides, a thatch of unruly flaxen hair, a ruddy, pleasant, square-jawed face, and eyes the cool grey of skepticism. So immediately he's this sort of like, you can picture him, right? This sort of like smooth-talking American guy who doesn't believe anything and sort of keeps life at a distance. And immediately there's this sort of conflict set up between him and Fevvers, like immediately, which I found really interesting. But yeah, are we going on to your bit? So
next slide.
He is very obviously interested in where Fevvers originated from. You know, is she born of women? Like, where does she come from? Where did she grow up? Are there mothers, brothers, sisters, fathers, people that can legitimize Fevvers' tale? And all the while she's telling him her background, he's looking for names and things that he can verify. So there's one bit I remember where she mentions a friend of hers getting surgery, and then that surgery was reported on like the London Review Journal, and he makes a note of that, but he can then check that and verify that. So that's kind of the crux of this chapter is all of these little details that we learn about Fevvers, and you know, whether or not we can like fully believe them.
Yeah. So she talks about her beginning where she was, I think, left at the door in front of a brothel, and she was brought in by Lizzie and other members of this brothel, including Ma Nelson, that owns the brothel, and she grows up there. But they, you know, as a child, she kind of plays the role as she kind of stands in the kind of entranceway and acts like a little Cupid. And they're very protective over her, like all the women in brothel. She's not like pushed into, you know, kind of sex trafficking or something.
I think she, as a child, she enjoys the sort of dress up and the
and
play
she loves
element.
That it's all, you know, she's being around all these women, and it's, you know, quite an empowering space for her in a way. But there's a kind of description of the kind of main kind of living room where I think clients kind of wait for, you know, and they sometimes spend time there, and it's kind of in constant darkness, like the whole house, like all the, you know, curtains are shut, and there's, you know, the living room's got this kind of dark red you know, wallpaper color, and it's very kind of gothic and you know, evocative, you know, and she notices this picture on the walls, which is like that, you know, you can see on the slide, and she says it hung above the mantelpiece, and I need hardly tell you that its subject was Leda and the Swan. So I always saw, as through a glass darkly, what might have been my own primal scene, my own conception, the heavenly bird in a white majesty of feathers, descending with imperious desire upon the half-stunned yet herself impassioned girl. When I asked Ma Nelson what this picture meant, she told me it was a demonstration of the blinding excess of the grace of flesh. So she's kind of is kind of introduced to her kind of unknown heritage in this kind of kind of primal scene, which of course refers to a kind of Freudian idea of, when kids, see a kind of scene of sexual nature. It might be them accidentally walking into their parents having sex, and it's like a sexual scene before they are really sexual. So it's like,
and also how it's
they
often
are
misconstrued as violence.
Yeah, and how it's misconstrued as violence because they don't really understand what's going on. They don't have that kind of context to what's going on. So she's kind of introduced to, her own kind of primal scene, and it also brings the question that, maybe her mother was a victim, and maybe she is the child of someone who, was a rapist. So it's kind of brings together that kind of, am I a beauty or beast?
And especially linking it again back to that Greek myth of Leda and the swan, again something that evokes great beauty. Like there are so many paintings of this one myth, this one story of Leda and the swan, some of them beautiful, some of them it's not a beautiful thing. Think about it, like just logistically for a second. Like it really toes that line between sort of grotesque and beautiful. And I think immediately linking that with Fevvers is really, really interesting.
Because when you think of swans, it's like a beautiful image, and then you have like this kind of strange scene. And we tried to find the specific picture that they talk about, because they talk about it like, Walser questions this because they talk about how it's like a real painting, and he's like, how did this, like a famous painting, how did this end up here? And he kind of questions it being a Titian painting, and we tried to find the painting, and it kind of came up with the one that's on the slide that's on the right.
The one with the creepy child.
Yeah, from the description, it doesn't really add up. So we were kind of thinking, did Walser get it wrong, or did Angela get it wrong? because there are, like, this scene has been depicted like many times, and maybe we are missing a Titian painting, but from our research we couldn't find one other than this.
So the one with the creepy child is the Titian, and then the one on the other side is the one that we think more closely resembles what she actually describes, because she describes the swan descending upon the woman. So it looks a bit more like the other one, but it's an interesting thing of, like, Walser himself trying to authenticate, trying to poke holes in the story, but maybe he's not like getting it right.
But then it's also like, thinking about it, I just thought now that with the Cupid, that's quite interesting because she kind of played that role.
Rowan's asked, is the child supposed to look like they are peeing? That's what I said. I told you it looked like he was peeing.
Yeah, it does.
And she's like,
the whole thing is that, I mean, both are uncomfortable, but especially the one on the right
with the child.
But I would say it's kind of interesting that she played Cupid, and then there's a kind
the
of
painting,
role of, so I don't know if it was, but the description doesn't quite go with the painting.
And then there's a section on from this where I was going to say later, Fevvers is coming of age. She's coming into her wings, and I think everyone in the brothel doesn't really know how far this is going to go. Is she going to keep little wings? Is she going to grow? Like, what is the situation?
Starts with just little tufts,
little stubby things. And then there's a section where Lizzie basically, the wings start to grow, and Lizzie's really encouraging Fevvers to fly, and like this is basically part of her coming of age, part of her rite of passage. She has to figure out whether or not she can fly like a real bird, And there's this really horrible scene where Fevvers is like on the top of the building, and she's looking out over London, and it's this high height, and she's worried and she's scared, and she thinks, oh, I don't actually need to know, and Lizzie just pushes her, cause she's like, if you don't do it now, then you never will. And then this is the scene where she says, and sir, I fell. Like Lucifer, I fell. Down, down, down I tumbled, bang with a bump on the Persian rug below me, flat on my face amongst those blooms and beasts that never grace no natural forest, those creatures of dream and abstraction, not unlike myself, Mr. Walser. And then I knew I was not ready to bear on my back the great burden of my unnaturalness. So good. But again, you know, her identifying even at that age that it was unnatural, that she was not, and referring to it as a burden, because that's, I guess, you know, the first glimpse that we get of it not being a blessing, right? Because we meet her in this lavish, you know, dressing room, and she's, you know, she's bubbly, she's funny, she's, you know, got a lot of sexual innuendo, she's got a lot of bravado about her, and this is the first glimpse that we get, I guess, of her viewing her wings as not some blessing, not a money ticket, but a burden, something that she's had to carry with her her whole life, that she's not been able to like get rid of, you know, and something that's maybe prevented her from living a certain kind of life that she may have wanted to.
And it's also, I mean, if we go back to like the painting, like seeing that, like, as well as it being a kind of primal scene of maybe like her, you know, representing her parents, it's also like that might be something like a first kind of point of reference for her, for what she is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, because she's obviously has these wings, and it's, you know, she maybe sees herself in that kind of dominant role, which isn't like, you know,
a pleasant thing,
isn't pleasant, but also isn't like really accepted, you know, as women, you know.
I like how everyone's so disturbed by the child in the painting. I'm so sorry.
I feel weird because this is the second time in our group that we've had these paintings up. Because it came up with Pandora's Jar.
We're just showing everyone's swan porn. Yeah. We promise it's not a kink, guys. I'm so sorry. Right, and so then I guess, you know, that leads us quite nicely onto, you know, discussing Fevvers' wings as burden. We then got onto the bizarre section where Fevvers meets a certain man. So this is our, I guess, question for this part is, how does our view of Fevvers develop after her encounter with Mr. Rosenkreutz, who's just a creep, actually. Yeah, he's just so weird.
Yeah, should we first kind of talk about how they kind of meet, I guess, because it's quite complicated. They go from like one place to another, and she ends up basically Ma Nelson dies, doesn't she? She dies, and then her brother then through the will owns the brothel, and he's disapproving and just kicks them all out. So
I think he doesn't open a home for like wayward girls or something, like a school or something, like finishing school or something.
Yeah, and then Fevvers moves in with Lizzie and some of Lizzie's family, but they're really struggling for money, so she ends up going to this other kind of strange
Madame Shrek's museum of
monstrous women, and there she has this client, Mr. Rosenkreutz, and she has a kind of personal meeting at his house, and it ends up to be this whole, she thinks that, you know, he's bringing her there for sex, but it's a whole other deal entirely, and he's there to have her as a sacrifice for some kind of ritual he's doing, and I mean,
it becomes very apparent that he doesn't want her for sex, because he hates vaginas.
Yes, he's got an odd thing about vaginas, and this is a quote. So he is talking about the kind of symbol of the vagina, and he's saying, Yoni, of course, in the Hindu, the female part, or absence, or atrocious hole, or dreadful chasm, the abyss down below, the vortex that sucks everything dreadfully down, 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 where terror rules. We were going to talk about basically the link between his kind of thoughts about the vagina.
And they're not just thoughts, by the way. He has like a statue in his house of like a phallic penis.
Yeah. So
And
he's
then
all about
around this penis
Yeah.
is like a twining rose, which represents the vagina, and it's like trying to pull down the upward motion of the penis. And he
Yeah.
also has that on a necklace, I think, as well.
He has it on a necklace as well.
Like a
And-
weirdo. So weird.
We kind of thought it reflected like kind of Freud's theory of like castration anxiety quite well, which is obviously it's about the kind of when you know, the male sees a vagina for, you know, Freud thinks that he can't help but see it as a castrated man, and as you know, women as you know, a body that has been mutilated, basically,
and then that brings up their own fear.
It brings up their own fear of being mutilated, which obviously is a very you know, a theory that's argued a lot, and like, you know, a lot of people don't agree with, but it's also like, it's also interesting because, you know, within like, I think the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of like Freud's becoming kind of popular again.
Yeah, I mean, Angela,
like,
across
kind
all
of,
her work, is very interested in Freud.
So it was kind of like this kind of rise of like a pop psychoanalysis, where it was kind of within, you know, pop culture. So it's the kind of thing that she would have encountered a lot,
and I guess maybe men of that time would have internalized as well.
Exactly. And we had a kind of quote, I think, on the next slide, which is the kind of,
this is from a Granta
article, and it's The Resurgence of the Monstrous Feminine by Hannah Williams. It's a really great article if you want to
we wanted to
read
put the whole thing in, it would be too long.
But yeah, so she says the female body has been codified as disgusting, defective, leaking, bleeding, oozing from time immemorial. She limps incomplete and half-finished across Aristotle's theories. A deformed monstrosity and a bit misbegotten man stalks through the Talmud on Lilith's jackal feet, riding through the night on her bird wings to sate her demon's appetite. Drags her heavy body through Greek mythology, crowned with curls of snakes.
Medusa.
Yeah. She's simultaneously too much and less than, little more than an undeveloped man, a fetus too weak to grow entirely, pale and fragile as an orchid. It's this that Freud evokes when he writes, probably no male human being is spared the fright of castration at the sight of the female genital. For Freud, the female body is defined by its fundamental lack, uncanny, strange, and unfinished. It's why so many euphemisms for the vagina focus on the female genitals as a wound. Cleft, axe wound, gash, the woman is always a site of violence. So, and I think this is, this kind of notion is kind of felt throughout the whole book as women, and particularly Fevvers, as a kind of site of unknown and kind of people, specifically like, I guess, the patriarchy being scared of that kind of
I mean, this encounter that she has with Rosencreutz, which we'll get into what exactly happens between them, it's very much mirrored with a similar encounter later on in the book, and I think those two run very parallel to each other. So we find out that Rosencreutz obviously doesn't want her for sex. He doesn't see her as a sexual object, because I think he doesn't really see her as a woman. He sees her as something in between. And there's a really beautiful speech that we'll get onto. We have the whole quote because it's beautiful. But he really wants to use her for this. It's like a May Day ritual, isn't it? But he's essentially trying to use her essence, or use her as a sacrifice to get immortality. Like, you know, bit cliche, but you know, bit Nicholas Flamel, if you ask me.
Why did you have to say that, Jess? You always say something funny, Jess, when I'm drinking.
I just can't contain it, B. I'm so funny.
Nicholas Flamel gives it back.
He does. Anyway, So, so yeah, Rosencrantz wants to. It's so funny because he just has this hatred, this detest, this fear of women, but yet he's so scared of his own death, his own mortality, that he needs to kill this woman in order to like use her. Like it's her life, her essence that he wants. It's just very metaphorical.
Which
so
actually,
instead of being dragged down by the women in
yeah.
his necklace, he's actually being propped up by them.
Which actually goes on from a later quote of this article, talks about I've forgotten her name, but
Hannah Williams.
No, it was she's referencing someone else's theory that she kind of talks about how obviously Freud makes about castration anxiety and how women are kind of less than, but she talks about how it's not the fact that they see a woman and think, oh, she's less than, it's that she is whole without the penis, and that's kind of threatening because they're all like the penis centered on the kind of phallic and the phallus as power, because also like when you talk about castration anxiety, it's not always just about the actual penis and vagina, it's about what that represents. So the phallus represents obviously kind of dominance and power, so women are kind of without that, but this woman that's quoted in the Hannah Williams article is talking about how she thinks that it's more that men are afraid of women because they see them as whole without
needing it,
penis,
which is interesting because then in this confrontation between Fevvers and Rosencrantz, she realizes what he's doing and that he doesn't intend to have sex because he's lying her down on this bee.
It was apple news.
So, is anything interesting happening?
10 places to buy in the UK.
So no. So he lays her down on this slab and he's saying all this random crap and she's like, okay, like let's just get it over with. And then I think it dawns on her that he's actually intending to kill her at this point. He's not wanting sexy time. So then she talks about seeing a knife at his waist, and I think the way it's described is really interesting. I think Angela obviously knows what she's doing. So lie down upon the altar. Wondering, I stretch out face down on the coffee table. He approaches with a purposeful stride. I'd have clenched my teeth and thought of England had I not glimpsed, peering over my shoulder, a shining something lying along his hairy, gnarled old thigh as his robe swung loose. This something was a sight more aggressive than his other weapon. Poor thing, that bobbed about uncharged, unprimed, unsharpened, in the cold, grey light of May morning. I saw this something was a blade. Quick as a flash, out with my own. How I blessed my little gilded sword. He fell back, babbling, unfair, unfair. He'd not thought the angel would come armed. Yet, sir, strike I could not, nor harm another mortal even in self-defence. And to tell the truth, even in the midst of my consternation, I was tickled pink to see the poor old booby struck all of a heap to see his plans awry, and he was as much put out when I laughed in his face as he was to see old Nelson's plaything. So this gilded sword that Fevvers pulls out, she got from her time with Ma Nelson. And I think it's interesting, again, like you talk about the phallus as a symbol, like, she said, oh, I'm not unarmed, I have something else that's shaped like your thing, haha. And he's very like taken aback by this. But then it's interesting,
a kind of castration
that she can't use it at this point. And then it very much, when you've read the whole book, it calls back the other experience that Fevvers has much later on at the end of the second part of the novel, the Petersburg part, where she gets called to the house of the Grand Duke, who again is obsessed with her. She comes into his house, he has an ice sculpture made of her, and he's like, I hope the heat of my house melts you just as it melts the sculpture. And she's like, all right. And then he, this section is quite horrific. He assaults her, and he breaks her sword. She tries to use her sword and he breaks it, and again that's another sort of symbolic thing of this thing that she sees as her protection, this thing that's gifted to her from Ma Nelson, this group of women, is something that is breakable, it is fallible, in the face of brute strength or whatever men. So yeah, that's interesting. And we talked about how this is, I guess, Fevvers, obviously she's not sheltered from the ways of the world. I mean, growing up in a brothel, I'm sure she had awareness of like things that were happening to the other women. But I think it's the first time, in this exchange with Rosencrantz, that she realizes that she is vulnerable. Because I think she always saw herself as more than, with the wings she can fly away. She's always kept at a distance. She's always had protection of either Ma Nelson or Lizzie, or even in the museum, like she's like protected from people coming directly up to her, I think, and she had like help from the others. But this is the first time where she's really, I think, exposed to like the violence and people's dangerous intent with her.
I think it also like, because she survives it, she kind of feels a kind of powerful, and using the kind of phallic symbol, that she's got the power. But when it goes to the Grand Duke, there's a kind of another kind of reveal from her, for her, and a kind of loss of naivety when it doesn't always work for women to kind of strike back the same way that men do, if that makes sense. But,
so there's a really beautiful passage in which Rosencrantz is sort of waxing lyrical about how he's going to use Fevvers and her specific essence and everything, and it's just a very beautiful sort of portrait of liminality, of her existing not as a man, not as a woman, but in this other space. And it again calls back that question: is she beauty? Is she beast? Is she fact fiction? Like, where does she exist? So the quote's on the screen, but I will read it out. Lady of the hub of the celestial wheel, creature half of earth and half of air, virgin and whore, reconciler of fundament and firmament, reconciler of opposing states through of mediation of your ambivalent body, reconciler of the ground opposites of death and life. You who come to me neither naked nor clothed, wait with me for the hour when it is neither dark nor light, that of dawn before daybreak, when you shall give yourself to me, but I shall not possess you. So again, I mean, beautiful language, but just painting. My God, did you hear that? Yeah, I hope you can't hear it, but like my neighbor is going to town on his piano right now, and it's like very distracting. Carl, stop. No, I want him to hear me. That's annoying. He does it at 3 a.m. as well. It's the worst. Anyway, so we get this portrait of Fevvers, again, not existing in any arena. Like she's obviously found kinship with women, and she's found love with women, and protectorship from Lizzie, but she doesn't feel wholly within that community either. She's existing in between. She's not a woman. She's something else. She's something mythical. And I like that description where he says neither naked nor clothed, because even when she's naked, she still has her wings, but then she's still vulnerable. And it just reminded me of that bit we were at school. We studied Lady Godiva, and she's like running naked through the town. They describe her as Tennyson describes her as clothed with dignity, which I thought was just interesting, because I like that poem. We spent a long time on that, I remember. So I just like that. Even though he's a shite character, I like this description of Fevvers, and I think it really encapsulates the sort of role that she occupies in the novel, and the fact that like maybe we're not meant to know, is she one or the other? She just is both and neither.
And I think I guess we see from his point of view that she's this kind of symbol of kind of death maybe, or a kind of Antichrist. So
this section, I guess, of the novel, the London section, sort of ends with, I guess, the main retelling of this experience of Rosencrantz, and Fevvers tells this to Jack Walzer, and then it's very funny. He sort of he feels like he's been there for a lot longer than he has, and it's this very sort of mythical like era. What's I meant to say? Aura. Thank you. And he walks her back home, but she doesn't let him walk her the whole way. He walks her part of the way, and then her and Lizzie go off, and he makes a snap decision that he's going to follow her to the circus, because she has an upcoming tour that she's going on with Colonel Kearney, and he basically he wants to know more. He hasn't been able, after interviewing her for hours, he hasn't been able to come to this conclusion of, is she fact or is she fiction? And so he makes a decision that he's going to follow her to the circus. And then we begin the next part of the novel, which is in Petersburg. There we go. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, we knew this was happening, but we have a lot of thoughts and opinions and lots of theory about the first section, the London section, which I think is both of our favorite section. Yeah. And then it sort of dwindles as you get further on in the novel, because not that there's less stuff happening.
I think it's just,
but the focus,
complicated.
The focus moves away from so the focus in the London part is definitely solely on Fevvers. Who is she? What's her upbringing? What is she like? And she is arguably the strongest character because we just know her, you know, inside and out. And then we come to the second part when she's on tour in the circus, and obviously there's all the other performers. There's the leader of the circus, Colonel Kearney. Walzer is there. And it does lose its focus a little bit. We shift focus from just Fevvers to this whole cast of characters, which we care less about, I'm gonna say. It's still beautifully written and there's still a lot there, but it's just less about, I guess, what we think is at the crux of the novel, which is, you know, gender and myth and magic and, you know, the era that women were living in at that time. There's less about that sort of ruminated on in this Petersburg section. But the first question we have is, what is meant by Colonel Kearney's obsession with the ludic game?
And
we don't know.
Ask anyone who's like been reading, or if anyone knows exactly like what this means, because he kind of refers to it all the time, saying, "Oh yes, we're playing the ludic game.
You've got to live the ludic game, son."
And it's just bizarre, because we looked up the kind of meaning of the word, which is kind of playfulness, and the etymology is,
so it derives from Latin.
So it's kind of saying that the game, and we like, is it the game of games, or like, you know, the big game, and there was a kind of there is a kind of, I guess, like history of like ludic literature that we kind of wanted to bring up, which is kind of, you know, things like Lewis Carroll, you know, a kind of playfulness with form, and you know, that's kind of what we kind of found out from you know, the history
I guess I'm not really sure why it's included so often, but there are sections of the book, obviously it's split into 3 sections already, but I think the third section in particular is the most abstract, and also the section where she switches the point of view, the perspective of the novel. So maybe that is what she is referring to, this sort of playfulness, and maybe the setting of the circus has something to do with that, the sort of the whirlwind, the sort of the liminality and the overwhelmingness of being in a space like that where you don't really know what's real and what's like, what you're seeing is to be believed, essentially, and maybe that's what she's referring to, this ludic game of, like, you know, the ultimate play, but also like the ultimate deceit,
kind of game of life, of, you know, them all trying to
get ahead,
get ahead, or just survive, you know, and we're going to talk about it later, about how they kind of go from one cage to another throughout you know, Fevvers. And
also, I guess, because their whole my knees like I'm just like coming very close to you, so I can't stretch out my knee. The whole thing of like their livelihood being play, essentially, especially with the clowns, because the clowns become very important, which we'll talk about in the next slide, because Walzer, you know, gets in with the clowns, and that's the whole thing.
That's how he gets into the circus, is to become,
he disguises himself. I mean, we can move on to that now. So how does Walter's character develop in this section, which is pretty clear? He becomes a clown. He basically, in order to gain admission to the circus, he pretends to be a clown so that no one knows that he's a journalist, that he's actually going to be writing about stuff that goes on.
He completely loses in this section, he completely loses his direction of, you know, running away with the circus for the purpose of, you know, for a journalistic purpose, to kind of write his article. I mean, at one point he has a injury, so he can't write, and then he just never kind of picks
well, yeah,
it
we
back
start
up.
out the Petersburg section. He's writing at little Ivan's house
Yeah.
with Ivan's grand, because he can't write in the circuits because people will hear
Yeah.
the typewriter and will figure out that he's a journalist. And then he never really goes back there.
Yeah, he kind of loses
Yeah.
himself in the
In this, which,
in the
yeah,
ludic game.
in the ludic game. But yeah, so Walzer adopts this identity of clown, and it's sort of interesting because I think at first, obviously, him being a very skeptical man, he sort of sees it as something that's like beneath him, I guess, in a way. Like it's something that's easy, you're just entertaining children, like you're putting shit on your face and just like and then you know, he sees it as sort of like the lowest of the low entertainment. Like at least, you know, Fevvers is like, you know, a beauty and she's skilled on the trapeze, and like there's a whole host of other characters, like one of them who dances with tigers, and you know, people who train the monkeys. Like, I think he sees, you know, legitimacy in those skills and those acts, but like less so in the clowns. And I guess that's why he adopts that identity, because it's kind of the easiest one to assimilate. You can't just make up being able to train tigers or being able to trapeze. Like it's the one that requires the least amount of skill in his eyes. And then he sort of learns that it's like the hardest, or he thinks it's the hardest, and the characters
psychologically,
yeah, and the characters that he meets, you know, there's Bufo, who's like the leader of the clowns, who has a lot of like Christ imagery applied to him, and they describe him as always sitting at like the middle of the table, like the Last Supper, and all of these clowns, and how they basically all come from really terrible walks of life, and the only way that they've made a living for themselves and been able to make it through is by clowning. And
they've all kind of lost their own identity within the mask of the clown.
And I think that's really beautifully stated in when he's putting on his own makeup and he's about to go out and perform. And he says, well, he doesn't say it. When Walzer first put on his makeup, he looked in the mirror and did not recognize himself. As he contemplated the stranger peering interrogatively back at him out of the glass, he felt the beginnings of a vertiginous sense of freedom during all the time he spent with the colonel, never quite evaporated, until his last moment when they parted company, and Walzer's very self, as he had known it, departed from him. He experienced the freedom that lies behind the mask, within dissimulation, the freedom to juggle with being, and indeed with the language which is vital to our being, that lies at the heart of burlesque. So obviously he describes it as a sort of freedom, but also as this complete loss of identity as well. So again, it's that very liminal thing of like, it's this beautiful, euphoric feeling, but at the same time completely devastating,
being, kind of out of society, being kind of, what are you if you, although it's, kind of being within that space where you're kind of a performer and you're constantly watched, and although that's suffocating, being outside of it, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah, exactly. I wish I'd got one of the sections where he talks about like the background of the clowns, but I can't find it now. Also, I wanted to mention Mignon just because I like her. I don't know how to like make her relevant to our discussion, but I do love
Princess's love story.
I do love her.
It's very nice.
And if anyone's seen Nightmare Alley, the new Guillermo del Toro picture, was pretentious. Mignon's storyline very much mirrors the storyline in that, where when she's sort of down and out on the street, she gets picked up by this man, her M, when she's in Germany. And he's basically this con man who just wants to make a quick buck, and he is this pretend psychic medium, and he basically takes photos of Mignon sort of through like hazy lenses and stuff, and basically sells them to people as the photos of their ghosts of their dead relatives and loved ones, and people pay him a lot for this. And then they come in for like real sessions where they see their family materialized in front of them through like a glass, but it's just Mignon. And then she ends up, he's abusive to her. I think he kicks her out, and then she ends up with in a pub as a waitress. Then she gets picked up by the ape man who's already at the circus, and then he's also abusive. and then she has an affair with the strong man, and they're different people,
Yeah.
the ape man and the strong man. And then there's an encounter with Walzer. He's in, oh God, yeah, there's so much that happens. He's in the ring, and she's there having sex with the strong man, just brazenly in the open. And then one of the tigers gets loose.
And he kind of abandons her.
The strong man abandons Mignon. And so I think Jack takes her under his wing. And while all this is happening, there's like a bit of jealousy going on because Fevvers, I think, well, he has feelings for Fevvers from the beginning.
And then also the strong man develops actual feelings for Mignon
later on,
but then she finds the princess. It's
who
nice,
plays music, and the tigers dance for her.
Also with the kind of seance kind of stuff, it also brings to mind the whole book's a kind of takes a lot from like actual history, and then like, you know, warps it into this kind of semi-real narrative, which I think brings a lot to the novel.
For sure. And also the specific places that we're in as well, I think are very interesting, like London being this whole hodgepodge of different people, different, you know, classes, different, you know, this sort of anonymous city. And then Petersburg, they talk a lot about Petersburg being on the cusp of greatness at this time. Before, I don't know a lot about geography, but is it
now Petersburg? But when Angela Carter wrote it,
it was St. Petersburg.
No, it wasn't. No, it is that is St. Petersburg, but it was named something else during, you know, kind of Lenin kind of era.
Oh, Leningrad.
Yeah, Leningrad. It was so it had a few names, but now it's now Petersburg again. So it's confusing because she talks about how it used to be named Petersburg, and
you're like, it still is.
but it's actually at that point, I looked it up, and I think in the 90s it changed back.
Oh, okay.
So
wow, a lot happened in the 90s. In sync and Petersburg changed you. You hate me.
Why wouldn't you say Backstreet Boys?
I should have said Backstreet Boys. I should have. So yeah, the second section is very. I think I like it more than the third, but it's still quite fractured. You're following a lot of different people. There was a whole section where I didn't understand that the people we were following were actually apes. They're the educated apes.
Or chimpanzees.
Well, they call them the educated apes in the text. They probably are, but that's what they call them. And then one of them can like speak, and he negotiates his contract. Oh my God, we didn't even talk about Sybil.
Sybil.
So the leader of the circus, Colonel Kearney, has this pig called Sybil, and he rubs her with oil, and she's this fortune-telling pig. So every time he's going to make a decision, he asks Sybil what she thinks, and she like signals to him in her little pig way.
Well, they have cards or something.
Have cards that she points to,
like tarot cards.
And it's not really relevant in like the grand scheme of things, I think there are these little tidbits of magical realism that pop through, also with Lizzie, which we'll talk about as well, because there's this, you know, back and forth of whether or not Lizzie is a witch. It's sort of suggested that she can do things that some people can't do, and that she can stop and start time. And in the first section, when the clock strikes midnight during Walz's interview with Fevvers, he thinks that hasn't it already struck midnight.
Yeah, it strikes.
Yeah, it strikes three or four times. Yeah. And then, you know, later on in the novel, again, when we end up in the last part, which we're nearing, there's another suggestion that Lizzie, you know, could potentially do something about their circumstances in a supernatural way. And again, it's just like we talked about so much already, but the blurring of like fact and fiction, and this liminal space where like anything can happen, really. Oh, we got a little picture of the tigers dancing. Isn't that nice? And that brings us on to Siberia, which is the last section of the book. And our question for those of you who've read it who are still with us, what's going on? So this last section is potentially the most impenetrable of the three. How did you find the reading experience? And we would love to hear from people who have read it, because this was definitely a slog for both of us, I feel.
Yeah, it just, I think Graduate kind of, I liked the kind of simplicity of the first part, where it was, kind of the narrative was kind of wrapped around with these sections of, Walter interviewing Feathers and Lizzie, and I just think that really worked well as a kind of self-contained kind of part of the book, and although I enjoyed, like, particularly part 2 and a chunk of part 3, there was a lot of new kind of it just kind of darted in different directions, and it was quite bizarre. Bizarre.
So we end part 2 with Fevvers escaping the Duke, again in a way that we're not entirely sure how this happens. At one moment she's in the Duke's clutches and he's, assaulting her, and she wants to leave. And I think she sees, like, she's trying to get to the train, like that's the thing, but the train, they're about to leave to Siberia, so she needs to get on the train to join the troop, which they describe as a depleted company. So again, there's quite a lot of turmoil that happens in the second section.
At the end of the second section, on the last performance in St. Petersburg, there's a big accident that
with
kind
Bufo.
of happens.
Bufo dies, doesn't he?
No, but Bufo gets taken away to because he goes a bit crazy.
Yeah.
And they lose the tigress. And they lose the chimpanzees because they
negotiate.
The colonel, and so the colonel's not feeling that great about their circumstances anyway, because they've lost quite a lot of their crew, and then something big happens.
The train crash. So Fevvers escapes from the Duke. We don't really know how, to be honest.
She kind of sees a toy train, and then suddenly
she's on the
real train.
So maybe Lizzie again. Maybe that's something that could be. She maybe he knows that she needs help. I don't know. Because she falls into Lizzie's arms, isn't she, when she gets onto the train? She's all her dress is ripped up and like covered.
And Lizzie's kind of always, there's always a kind of bickering between them, because Fevvers is kind of optimistic, whereas Lizzie's not, and she's kind of trying to kind of stop Fevvers from doing things that might harm her or them, and she's kind of like, I told you so,
which mums often are. So when we begin the third part of the Siberia section, we're on the train, and it's sort of Fevvers are licking her wounds, and I think Lizzie is advising her against this sort of growing situation with Walter. I think Lizzie's obviously aware that they have to get eats for each other, and she's not very happy with it. And suddenly this train crashes, and they're all like sprung apart. They're all separated. And then when in the midst of the crash, in the rubble and the debris, Fevvers can't find Jack, and then suddenly they get kidnapped by some random rebels, and they get taken away.
A group of just men,
random guys,
isn't it?
I think so.
They're all kind of outlaws.
We find out why, because basically these guys have blown up the train because they believe that Fevvers is in a relationship or romance with the Prince of Wales, and that they can use her as a bargaining chip to extort money from the royal family, which, like, props to you guys, go for it. But it's just it basically turns out to be not true, and it's just bluster in the newspapers, and Fevvers isn't actually engaged with any member of the royal family. So like these rebels quickly find out that they can't really do anything with their hostages, and they're all just sort of stuck in the wasteland of Siberia, of the really harsh landscape, and Fevvers is sort of mourning Jack. She doesn't know what's happened to him, and then we cut back and we realize that Jack has in the accident completely lost his memory.
Yeah,
and he's just
got
talking
his head
gibberish.
thumped.
Yeah. And then he gets found by, oh god, this is where it gets
He gets found by a
confusing.
group of women who is basically, if you remember little Ivan that is with that Walser stays with when he's, you know, writing in Petersburg, and it also stays, that was where all the clowns stayed. Yeah, so little Ivan is a little boy who stays with his grandmother because his mother kind of, basically he never really knew his mother, and she was sent to this kind of prison for shooting the father or killing the father because he was being abusive. And so then we go to meet the mother who's at this prison for women who basically murdered or assaulted their husbands, because
but women that the government think could be reformed, so it's not like an average prison,
because it's often, you know, due to them being abused. And it's this panopticon
penitentiary
prison. I can't remember, we were going to do
it's page 248.
Yeah, so and we kind of were talking about how, are we doing this on the next slide? I'm just thinking for the cage slide.
Oh, yes.
Because we were talking about how,
so I guess the way that we'd wrap up the discussion, and also just this last section, is like talking about the recurring symbol, which we think is basically entrapment, imprisonment, but within a gilded cage, which is a direct quote from the book, but it's also really apparent in this section about the women's prison.
Yeah, and it's also like, well, I'll read the quote first and then talk about it. That during the hours of darkness, the cells were lit up like so many small theatres, in which each actor sat by herself in a trap of her visibility, in those cells shaped like servings of baba rum.
Yeah.
The countess in the observatory sat in a swivelling chair whose speed could regulate at will. That she could regulate at will. Round and round she went, sometimes at a great rate, sometimes slowly, raking with her ice blue eyes. She was of Prussian extraction. The tear of unfortunate. Yeah, so round and round she went, sometimes at great speed, sometimes slowly, raking with her ice blue eyes the tear of unfortunate women surrounding her. She varied her speed so that the inmates were never able to guess beforehand at just what moment they would come under her surveillance. So it's a kind of prison of, what was it that we kind of called it? I wrote it because
punishment through constant visibility.
Yeah, so it's a punishment through constant visibility, and it's.
I mean, it's not a mistake that she likens it to small theatres, is it? And each woman in the prison is an act.
Exactly. So it's kind of more so, I guess, showing how like the circus and, you know, a lot of these kind of areas that Fevvers has performed in are very much like this idea of the panopticon prison, which is a design of prison where it's like in a circle, and that, you know, there's the cells lined all round that, and there's a kind of one thing in the middle, which is where the guard can kind of, you know, and it's got windows so they can just scroll round and see, you know, everyone at any time. And also the inmates can always see each other, so you're always on show whether the guard's seeing you or the other, you know, inmates. So it's a kind of torture through lack of privacy. And it's very much, you know, and obviously, like we've talked about in the other discussions of like the panopticon as being an example of how like the girlfriend gaze works,
Yeah.
and you know,
But
and
I
those
think
kind of, you know,
mm,
gazes in
yeah,
society, and but the thing that we were kind of talking about is that how, you know, they kind of, she relates all these kind of different um ways of kind of performance, and how, you know, Feathers kind of has no privacy
yeah.
to herself and is always under surveillance.
Even from Lizzie, who was like a friend and a caregiver.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting as well is that obviously throughout the novel, Fevvers faces a lot of violence and a lot of pain at the hands of men, and obviously that's an indictment on the patriarchy and the times in which she's living in. And obviously Angela Carter in her wider work is interested in the violence of men and you know, women and men's places in the world. But I think what's really interesting in Nights at the Circus is that even when Angela Carter writes about all female spaces, they're still in prison.
Yeah.
So even with Ma Nelson at the brothel, that's a
That's
form of
still,
imprisonment, a form of
yeah.
being gazed upon, a form
And
of
she
being.
doesn't recognise
Yeah.
his places as prison, so she's kind of flying from cage to cage.
Yeah, for sure.
thinking,
And then she goes to again to that museum where her whole job there is again to be
Yes.
observed and to be lauded
Yeah.
at, and there is no privacy there either. And then she goes from that to Rosencrantz, who again is, you know, she has no privacy and is you know, violent and but even like, yeah, looking at just the spaces in the book which are female only spaces, like the women's prison or the brothel, or even like the museum was like a women's
also the
monster
circus,
museum.
specifically the London, she specifically describes where they perform in London as a panopticon itself, like the arrangement of, you know, them performing in the center, and you know, visible well. So it's
yeah, and I think in more ways than one, you know, she talks about again in relation to Fevvers always being in a gilded cage, because Fevvers arguably is a very successful woman. She's got a much better life than a lot of the other women at this time clearly have. You know, the women in the brothel, the women in the prison. Fevvers is very, very rich. I think if you look up the conversion rate for how much Fevvers earns, it's like 10 million in today's money. She's a very wealthy woman, and she always talks very brazenly about doing anything she, you know, she will degrade herself in any way just to make the next check. She's very focused on money and her own position and advancing that position.
She sees that as power.
For sure, yeah. But it's not, because like that's what the whole phrase, it's a gilded cage.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful, you know, golden, luxurious, but it's still a cage. And she doesn't have a lot of freedom, and you know, she still finds herself, you know, like what you say, you know, being imprisoned by having to be visible and having to, you know, sell her body, or, you know, show her body. And you picked up on another quote that Lizzie says to Fevvers, I think it was page 217.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Which again just sort of encapsulates that whole struggle. Where is it?
You can,
you got it.
Yeah, so she says you must give pleasure of the eye, or you're good for nothing. For you, it's always a symbolic exchange in the marketplace. You couldn't say you were exchanged in productive labour, now could you, girl? So she's saying basically that the only way she has value, a place, value and a kind of place in society is through her kind of being able to be gazed at, and, you know, kind of try and use the kind of patriarchal gaze to her advantage, but then you find out it's not really ever quite to her advantage.
And I think this also has another meaning as well, in the fact that this love story with Walter, and they end up together after he gets over his bloody amnesia. He has a whole thing where he gets found by this shaman who believes that his like amnesia ramblings are like prophetic and the words of some deity, and that he can see to the other side. It's just ridiculous. There's this whole like bear sacrifice that we don't care about. And then eventually they find each other because Fevvers ends up at the house of this piano man who's this man who was given a grant to start a music school in the middle of Siberia, and no one showed up, so he's just like sitting at his piano, and he's literally like dusty and cobwebby by the time they find him. And they're like, all right. And then they see each other like across the snow, don't they? And she's like, Jack. And they end up, you know, together. And if you know about Angela Carter in her life, she was very famously quoted as saying that she believed that marriage was another form of slavery, and she was very, I think, against the idea of women marrying. Like this, I mean, at the time that she lived, women didn't have a lot of rights. When you got married to a man, you gave up your name, you gave up your assets, you gave up your money, and he
Even
could divorce
things
you,
like,
and you couldn't divorce him.
like we were talking, like marital rape wasn't considered a thing until I think it came under the law in like 1991 or 2 or something, where it was you could, because beforehand
it was illegal to rape your wife.
Sex was expected, for men, basically.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes sense, and then so this sort of happy ending of Fevvers and Walser ending up together is still, like the whole of the book. It's a gilded cage. It's she gets what she wants and she's happy, but she's not free.
And it's also with particularly like the romance between Walser and Fevvers. There's this thing very near the end where she's kind of talking about how obviously Walser is a journalist and is trying to, his original intention was to write this article about her, and she's kind of talking about how all these people in her life came to take away her singularity as though it was their own invention, as though they believed she depended on their imagination in order to be herself. She felt herself turning willy-nilly from a woman into an idea. So it's kind of that, kind of even her, within this, relationship with Walser, is even her identity going to be taken because he's going to create her identity in his piece, and that's, I
mean, there's a quote that I liked on 336 where Lizzie and Fevvers they like stumble on a woman giving birth and they have to help her give birth in the middle of the snow. A lot happens in the last and then Lizzie says, unless there's tableau of a woman in bondage to her reproductive system, a woman tied hand and foot to that nature which your physiology denies, Sophie has been set here on purpose to make you think twice about turning from a freak into a woman. So Lizzie's very scathing, I guess, about the nature of being a woman, biologically and also in general, being literally, she says, enslaved to your biology. And she said, will make you think twice because, at this point, Fevvers is pursuing Walser and wants to find him. And Lizzie's encouraging her, think twice about, do you actually want to be a woman? And that's that whole thing of she's not a woman, she's a freak, and she exists above that. And she's like, do you actually want to give that up?
Kind of not necessarily above, but just out of that sphere. So she can't be.
So she's asking her
to down in the same
to
way.
Think twice about whether she wants the realities of being a woman.
But if she, goes into marriage with him, that's what she will kind of run into. And also that there's, continuing with her kind of like identity crisis with, the quotes, she felt her outlines waver, she felt herself trapped forever in the reflection in Walser's eyes. For one moment, just one moment, Fevvers suffers the worst crisis of her life. Am I fact or am I fiction? Am I what I know I am, or am I what he thinks I am?
Ooh,
so
that's a good one.
It's
I mean, that sums it up perfectly, doesn't it? Yeah.
But they end up together,
I know.
Which
I guess is realistic. So I mean, but I like that idea because his whole journalistic pursuit was to be: is she fact or is she fiction?
He's given up that.
And no, I think she hasn't in a way. And what's interesting is that even if he doesn't come to his own conclusion, he still sees her in a different way to the way that she sees herself. And so that's the thing: is that is she fact or is she fiction? Well, it doesn't really matter because everyone who meets her sees her in a different way that she's not privy to, so it doesn't actually matter whether or not concretely in the truth, it just matters how she's perceived. Which brings us back to like the panopticon stuff.
Yeah.
Almost like we know what we're talking about. Wow. Oh.
It was definitely like a difficult
Read.
but yeah. Because I think there were so many kind of you know, so many kind of different directions it went.
Yeah. Especially in the last part.
Yeah.
I mean, incredibly written though, every stretch.
And there were parts, even though, you know, we struggled a bit with the third section. I loved that whole chapter set at the prison, the women's prison. I think it could have, some chapters felt like they could have even been like short stories in themselves, because there was a lot that we didn't discuss about within the first part of the kind of history of some of the women in that kind of museum of monstrous women. And their, you know, I mean, we've discussed it a bit with Mignon's kind of history of, you know, being the kind of ghost girl, but there was just like, the book was full of kind of little stories within the bigger picture. So
which is nice and it isn't in a way. Because, you know, so much of, I mean, I like that because so much of the start is about Fevvers and, you know, is she this or is she that, and then it sort of derails that, and, you know, we come back to it at the very end when she realizes that it doesn't really matter because she is whoever people see her as. Very good book. Where does it rank for you with the other two? I know that Bloody Chamber is top because obviously.
I have to say I really love the Magic Toy Shop, and I think like maybe we should even do it in our like book group, because I mean, especially like the first, it's a bit like, for me it was a bit like the experience of reading this book, because with the first section,
Rowan says, I think I enjoyed the book you're describing more than the book I read, if that makes sense. I mean, I feel that sometimes as well, as in, like, you know, you read a chapter or a section that makes kind of no sense, and then you Google a little bit and you read about all the theories around it, and you're like, oh, like, that's what she's getting at. And you think, oh, if I had read that chapter with that knowledge, I would have appreciated it more. And I definitely felt that with the Siberius. I did not appreciate that section as I was reading through it, but now picking out certain quotes that were like, oh, you know, that's what we were leading to, it's like, oh, that makes sense. But I just think altogether it was a sort of towards the end a pacing
she
thing.
references things so much, and like I feel like I'm definitely missing out on like a lot of references to, you know, literature and kind of like historical things. So I mean, it's definitely one I think I'll go back to.
Yeah, for sure.
And you know, as I was saying, like I love the Magic Toy Shop, but I found kind of similarly to this, I absolutely like best thing ever written, like the first few chapters, like it's amazing. And then you know, the kind of middle section is like really good too, and it's like, obviously it's like coming of age, the kind of narrative, which is, it's really beautiful and it's just stunning. I would definitely recommend it, but the ending's quite straight. There's like an incest between, I think, a brother and a sister, and it's kind of a bit bizarre. So it kind of ends with that, and
the bad taste in one's mouth.
I mean, it's a very dramatic ending, and
don't spoil it.
So
no, I'm definitely like, I mean,
I
Angela Carter with Only the Bloody Chamber solidified herself as one of my favorite authors, so I'm definitely not gonna.
I think they're still 5-star books for me, to be honest, because there's so much in them.
I think I gave
especially Bloody Chamber. Obviously, there's no fault in that for me. I think in some ways,
apart from maybe the Puss in Boots story.
But even that,
I know.
but and I definitely say the Bloody Chamber and Magic Toy Shop are definitely 5 stars for me. And then this sits between kind of 4 and 5.
I think I gave this 4 just purely on the last section, and also because I just said she's never going to touch the greatness of the Bloody Chamber for me, which is like one of my favorite books.
Yeah, I think same for me with both the Magic Toy Shop and Bloody Chamber.
I need to read that. I think I have.
We need to. Yeah.
Right. So with the conclusion, with the discussion on Nights at the Circus concluded. Oh Jesus! I've said too many words in the last hour, and my brain's like turning too much. We turn our attention now to the next 3 months.
I got like a shiver of excitement, and I tried to hold it because it was like weird. But...
That's so cute. Right. So this month's book, which obviously like. It's a bit late to start it now, but you can start it now. I'm sure you can read it. It's not that long. Oh my god, sorry, my foot. So February's book is Love and Colour by Bula Babalola, which is an anthology of stories of love with a West African focus, I believe. So traditional
a lot with
mythology as well. But I think it's very much about decolonizing those stories of love and those sort of myths about love and traditional sort of like fairy tales.
Like short story.
Yeah.
Collection.
Well, I guess Pandora is not really short stories, but it's different chapters, non-fiction. So I'm really excited to dive into that. So obviously that was our sort of Valentine's-y pick, which is exciting. And then March, Christ, I'm so excited. March, we're reading Gallant by V. Schwab, and if you've heard of V.
to pre-order the gorgeous colour.
You do. Get on that. So for anyone who's read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, that book was huge on BookTube last year for a good reason. I mean, some people don't like it, but if you loved Addie or didn't love Addie and want to just try another visual book, we'll be reading it. It comes out on the 1st of March, so we're getting in there hot. So please do read it with us if you're going to be reading it and come to the discussion. Very excited for that one because I loved Addie LaRue and I really enjoyed the Schwab's Darker Shade of Magic series when I was a teenager. So this is very up my street as well. We're not just shoehorning it into the book club because I want to read it. It's very much like about girlhood about
she goes from a girls' school and then to a
gothic crumbling house where her family are keeping secrets. It's very vibey. So. And then in April is very exciting. You heard it here first.
1 year.
We're reading the Penelope Ad by Margaret Atwood because April, if you don't know, is the 1 year anniversary of Briar's book club, and we started with Cat's Eye last April, and so we thought it would be really nice to do something full circle. And this April we're going to be reading the Penelope Ad, and it's just something that's been on my radar anyway because it's focusing on the Odysseus myth, but focusing on Penelope. So it's just what we love, fairy tale myth, and with a focus on women. So it just felt like the right book to do for April.
It also kind of harks back to us doing like the Pandora's Jar and so it's very exciting.
So we really hope that you'll be able to join us for the next month's books, and I hope you've enjoyed our discussion on Nights at the Circus, and we can't wait to hear more of your thoughts on the next picks.
Thank you.
So I think that's everything from us this evening. Go off and frolic and enjoy the rest of your evening. We need to go and eat.
Yeah.
I was very worried my stomach was going to start rumbling in the middle. I hope you had a wonderful time with us. We had a wonderful time with you, and we will see you soon next month to discuss Love and Colour. Bye! It's always so awkward, isn't it? Oh no! I hate doing the outro.